Eco Money on Money FM 89.3.
This is Eco Money on Money FM 89.3. I'm Rachel Kelly. It may be odorless, tasteless, and colorless, but when it comes to sustainability, green hydrogen is a hot topic. What is it, though, that differs green hydrogen from blue, and what is pink hydrogen anyway? To find out, I spoke with Dr. Thomas Collar. Dr. Collar is the APAC hydrogen lead at DNV, that's an independent expert in assurance and risk management. DNV recently published a hydrogen forecast to 2050, and it states that the global hydrogen uptake is very low and late relative to the Paris Agreement requirements, reaching just 0.5% of global final energy mix in 2030 and just 5% by 2050. Although the share of hydrogen in the energy mix, it says, in some of the world regions will be double these percentages. Now, Dr. Collar, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
You're very welcome. Many thanks for the invitation.
So hydrogen, it's the most abundant element in the universe. Yet, as the DNV report highlights, it is costly to produce as a low-carbon and renewable energy carrier. And it's renewable that we really want to focus on because it's green hydrogen that has been in the spotlight of late. Break it down for us. What exactly do we mean by green hydrogen?
So the term green hydrogen refers to hydrogen that is produced using renewable electricity through a process called electrolysis. And this method uses an electrical current to separate the hydrogen from the oxygen that's in water. And if this electricity is obtained from renewable sources, then the energy that's produced will be produced without emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. There are different types of electrolysis technologies, and alkaline and proton exchange membrane or PEM are the most commercially mature, and there might be different reasons for selecting one of these over others.
Okay, so what's the difference between blue and green hydrogen, and why does it even matter?
So green hydrogen is distinct from blue hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is made from natural gas using a process called steam methane reformation or autothermal reformation. And here, the emitted carbon dioxide from this process is captured and stored, and used for another purpose. There are very different technologies, and one uses renewables as an input, and the other uses natural gas as an input.
So an interesting point from the DNV report, and that is going back to how hydrogen is used, because you highlight that hydrogen has been used in large quantities for well over 100 years as a chemical feedstock in fertilizer production and in refineries. But your report also highlights that the present use of hydrogen as an energy carrier is negligible, and that's because the production of hydrogen itself must be decarbonized, currently at a high cost, before it can play a prominent role in the drive to decarbonize the energy system. So what are the potential uses that we see further down the road for green hydrogen?
Maybe 2 points to make here. The first is that it's important to situate hydrogen within the wider energy transition that's taking place as countries and companies move to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to comply with emission commitments and the UN's Paris Agreement, and really to reduce the worst impacts of climate change. And within this broad energy transition, hydrogen has only a small but nonetheless important role to play. The most pronounced part of the energy transition is the electrification of the energy system. But there are some use cases where hydrogen is a good answer because it's difficult to electrify those use cases.
Could you give us some examples?
So there's a number of use cases for hydrogen, and some have better arguments around them than others. But it's really important to look into the detail and the value proposition. What works in some cases might not work in other cases. And this is one of the key ways in which we help organizations within the industry help navigate these difficult climates and uncertainty. Within the green hydrogen space, there's a lot of potential for use of green hydrogen to replace grey hydrogen production pathways and decarbonize certain sectors that are necessarily using hydrogen to produce ammonia, to produce explosives, fertilizer, to produce methanol, which in turn produces many of the plastics and everyday items that we use throughout our daily lives.
So, Dr. Thomas, what's your take then on the role that green hydrogen will play in the energy transition? You've touched on it briefly there, and you've shared that at the moment, green hydrogen or hydrogen takes up a very small percentage if we're looking at alternative energies and the energy transition. But how do you see the mix evolving going forward?
Well, DNV's energy transition outlook, modeling, forecasts, and analysis looks at the picture from a global perspective in terms of how we're currently tracking. And we see that by 2050, the share of electricity will double from today's levels. The amount of coal and oil in the energy mix in 2050 will reduce, but there'll still be a role for them, as there will for natural gas. Hydrogen as an energy carrier entering that space has a very negligible role today, but we forecast growth beginning in the 2030s and continuing out to 2050 and beyond. By 2050, we only expect hydrogen and indeed some of the fuels that can be derived from hydrogen, such as green ammonia and e-fuels. Those will only represent around 5% of global energy demand. So it's still a very small part of the energy transition and final energy demand required to deliver a net zero settlement.
What's your take on the conversation around natural gas being the solution to phase out of fossil fuels?
Our view is that blue hydrogen, so natural gas, but with the storage or utilization of carbon dioxide, does have an important role to play in delivering net zero. Some countries are very well suited to develop large volumes of renewable electricity and produce green hydrogen to support those use cases where hydrogen is required. But other countries, and there's some good examples within the Asia Pacific region, are not able to produce as much renewable electricity and may require blue hydrogen to be produced elsewhere, or green hydrogen to be produced elsewhere, converted into means of other energy and transported over to them, stored and then used in those environments. So it's very much a horses for courses, different technologies depending on the situation at hand.
I'm Rachel Kelly, and you are listening to Eco Money on Money FM 89.3, and we're speaking with Dr. Koller. He's the APAC hydrogen lead at DNV, and he's talking to us about the future of green hydrogen. Dr. Koller, there have been numerous articles on hydrogen's role in the road towards more sustainable energy, and some would argue that it isn't as green as positioned. Where are we now when it comes to green hydrogen's infrastructure? Because that's what they're talking about, isn't it? And what's the current state of play when it comes to green hydrogen in Asia?
DNV is an expert on infrastructure to support the energy transition. We offer advisory services, verification on concepts and designs and construction and operation of facilities to support the energy transition, as well as certification to recognize a successful assessment according to certain standards. And within the hydrogen space, this is an increasing area of focus for us. Different hydrogen molecules can be produced using different technologies. We've spoken about green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, and there's gray hydrogen, pink hydrogen, turquoise hydrogen, white hydrogen, lots of different colors of hydrogen that we can discuss. A hydrogen rainbow. But the importance here is that those different production pathways have different greenhouse gas emissions associated with it. And indeed, then once you produce the molecule, transporting that molecule and using it in different ways can also, depending on how it's transported, how it's used, cause different levels of emissions. So although we're talking about hydrogen as a simple molecule, the production, transport, and use can lead to vastly different emissions associated with that molecule. Now, the hydrogen colors help indicate and direct us in this way. But it's also possible for life cycle analysis to be undertaken to more precisely measure the emissions. And to support this process and really to create a best practice, there are a number of hydrogen emissions and sustainability standards that are being developed by countries and by organizations. And these establish particular requirements for the hydrogen to conform to, and to which producers of hydrogen can check that their hydrogen has those necessary attributes. And we've published a service specification at DNV that sets out details of how we can validate different claims that a hydrogen producer may wish to make to demonstrate that they meet a particular standard. So a producer might want to demonstrate they produce hydrogen at a very low greenhouse gas emissions intensity, but they may also want to demonstrate that they have used very little water in producing that, or that they've adhered to best practice in modern slavery provisions and other sustainability imperatives. Meeting these standards and being able to demonstrate that you meet these standards is very likely to be necessary for permitting and approvals, as well as to access capital to support these projects. So it's a very important aspect of the emerging hydrogen industry.
Where are we right now in Asia when it comes to green hydrogen production?
The situation today in Asia is that it's the largest LNG importing region in the world. There are a number of new LNG import terminals in development, and that's a trend we see continuing for a number of years. Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia are leading LNG producers, and indeed, those markets are very dependent on Asian demand. Seaborne and pipeline transportation helps move that commodity around the region. But as we proceed with the energy transition, we do see that picture changing over time. We're likely to have variety in the fuels that are being transported. So hydrogen may be converted into ammonia for transport, it might be shipped in liquid form at very low temperatures. Some pipelines may be able to be repurposed to transport future fuels. In other instances, new infrastructure might need to be built. Fuels in the maritime sector will also change. Some ships may be able to run on ammonia, others on methanol, others on ethanol. There's certainly uncertainty around this picture today, and uncertainty keeps the price high. There is risk in being a first mover, moving too fast as a ship manufacturer, for example, in signaling that your fleet in the future will run on methanol might expose you to the risk of there not being sufficient low carbon quantities of that fuel when your fleet is ready. And to reduce this risk and improve cost of the project and indeed energy security, again, the number one action for countries in Asia would be to maximize the renewable resource potential, particularly solar and wind. In the face of this uncertainty, our view is that production of new sustainable fuels will tend to migrate to the locations that have the most competitive renewable resources. So, for example, the gigawatt scale renewable electricity projects planned for Australia could certainly bode well for Australia being one of these competitive areas. Another change that we see is in the maritime fuel bunkering situation, where today this is highly concentrated in Singapore, with ships very rarely refueling in other locations. But in the future, bunkering may increasingly shift from a centralized to a decentralized solution.
That was Dr. Thomas Collar. He is the APAC Hydrogen Lead at DNV. He's been sharing with us about the future of green hydrogen. Thank you for listening to this week's edition of Eco Money. And if you'd like to tune in to more episodes, you can do so by searching for us on Spotify. Just have a look for Eco Money with Rachel Kelly. This podcast is also available on audio. That's AWEDIO, the audio app, Apple Music, and of course the Money FM 89.3 website. Signing out for now, I'm Rachel Kelly.